Check it. Look how cute these are. I swear it'll be relevant in a minute. Hello everyone. So here I am in my little witchy cave, my dark and not quite cool enough witchy cave. Today seems a little bit warmer than I was anticipating, but to be honest, the heating system in this apartment is completely shot, so I may need to investigate and see if we have some kind of radiator coming on too much in need of bleeding or something like that. Anyway, I have been struggling to make this video for a couple of weeks now, and I suspect this is because it's one of those things, as per usual, that kind of links into basically everything else in life. I think even just by definition it's supposed to. But what I'm going to try to do is cover it in various ways in various videos over time. Hopefully limit each video that I make on the topic to a sort of a loose grouping of ideas so that there's some kind of component or theme that links everything per video. That's the goal at any rate. So I do actually have notes today. So the thing that I want to talk about is this notion of astral world building, what goes into that process, I suppose also why it matters, but very distinctly the sort of process element of that, of world building on the astral. I suppose you could say what techniques go into it, but it's also what life experiences, what practicing it feels like, and where it comes from in terms of personal reference points and inspiration. One of the things that's kind of been really consistent about me ever since I was quite young, as I've indicated before on this channel, is that my inner world is very, very detail-oriented, very atmospheric, and quite sad, quiet, melancholic, even nightmarish. There's an element of incredibly spooky stillness about it. There are personal reasons for this to be the case, reasons that have more to do very specifically with my story, the type of kid I was, certain things I experienced, starting when I was really extremely young. I believe I've mentioned once before on the channel my very, very distinct memories that can be pinpointed in time, for example, through checking with an external person to reference it, start from the age of 2 years old. And those memories would have included a lot of very distinctive input, full conversations, the emotional landscape of the adults around me in particular, incredible visual detail, and so on and so forth. So my entire way of using my imagination stems from the fact that I am who I've been all this time. And that's going to be the case for kind of everybody, and that's part of what results in different imaginative experiences. But also, something that goes into all of my astral realms, and again, the point of me talking about like myself in this regard is to kind of illustrate some of the ways in which a person can gather inspiration over time, but also it's part of like the method of inquiry for figuring out where these things come from for you, and then perhaps, as I've been recently, taking certain elements of that and purposefully highlighting it so that you guide your own astral journey in a particular direction, and then allow that to, in a reflexive manner, inform your waking real world consensus reality life. There are a few things that kind of have really, really distinctly influenced this particular way in which I build my astral worlds over time. I will start by mentioning two different movie references. The first and most significant for the purpose of today's video is the 1994 movie, I believe it was 94, Secret Garden, with Kate Maberly as the main actress, Hayden Prowse, and I don't remember all of the actors in it. It has Maggie Smith, it has John Lynch. That movie, and very specifically the early parts of the movie, from the segment in the movie in which she leaves the docks and there's that incredibly amazing English horn style song that they play in a minor key as they kind of drive their carriage over the moors. from that point in the movie up through the early days in the garden, every single thing about that, even when I watch that movie today, are the types of details that just make immediate sense to me, the kind of sound experience that make immediate sense to me, the quietude, the privacy, the deep, deep sadness, and in particular the sort of scary horror component that incidentally, of course, is also a very fairy tale component of that early part of the film. I remember when she first wakes up in her room in Misselthwaite Manor, the details of all the tapestries all along the walls, and the old furniture, and every single color and texture around her, the fact that there's a secret door behind one of the tapestries and so on and so forth, including also, by the way, Maggie Smith, even though she, in the movie version, as opposed to the book, is clearly a much more villain character. I won't discuss the movie too much because I have opinions about the nuance of that, but her clothing, I mean, I think we know at this stage that like that movie on every level just like went straight into the brain. Martha's clothing. So from a textural standpoint, and then especially Mary's character wandering the hallways, the forgotten parts of this seemingly endless manor house. Everything about that was like, oh, I can do that in my imagination. Of course, I would love for it to be real and something I could experience in reality. But that's exactly the sort of thing that I can do in my imagination. All it requires is me. I can think about those aesthetics. I can think about tapestries. I can picture these things. I can look these things up. I can research them. I can understand the musical components in those scenes, and I can weave that in to my imaginary realm. And I've been doing that since I was really, really little. I believe I would have been... I think it came out in 94, so I would have, you know, I was born in 87, so you do the math, I can't. Another movie that would have influenced me really intensely in a similar way, and certainly was a very strong determining factor for much of how my life has gone, is Secret of Roan Inish, which, pun intended, does actually hold water folklorically, which is really, really nice to realize that my very early exposure to Irish relevant material was, first of all, Irish made, and second of all, done very well. Again, featuring John Lynch, who is like totally my type. That's my type. That's my type. Anyway, it's like those moody, strange, quiet types. Less my type in Secret Garden. Anyway. So what we have with that movie as well, it's very, very pagan otherworldsy in its overall color scheme and in its sense of vast openness, wherein one wanders outside and encounters things straight out of myth that simultaneously look, in many ways, the most mundane and natural, because, again, my perspective these days is that those are the same thing. And this comes from this sort of exposure to things, and then, of course, things I pursued later on. So what we have with these movies is a sense of setting, a sense of very distinctive types of locations that, in my case, involve a lot of historical decor. In The Secret Garden, it's obviously the upper echelons of society and the color schemes and the sort of legacy material that would have come along with that. And I will leave a video I made about concepts around death and decay and resources of cultural heritage and the archiving profession, and why I kind of link those things and how I link those things. So that video will be linked somewhere here. In the other movie, we have much more folk motifs in people's houses. We have thatched cottages, so it's in many ways the opposite end, or an opposite end of the social scale. But once again, it is very much rooted in a very distinct landscape and a very distinct atmosphere with very distinct sounds and visuals and music and even like quality of air or visuals in it. So we have these two examples of the ways in which one's environment is crafted in a very multimedia way, and that's part of what makes really good storytelling. I'm going to show cutaways as well, because of course, as we know on this channel, I'm deeply, deeply influenced by medieval and Northern Renaissance aesthetics. Those are my colors. In particular, the Northern Renaissance colors are just everything that I want in life. But I have also mentioned on this channel the ways in which those time periods interplay with, say, the mid-19th century, as we get the advent of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, very purposefully making references back to that, the arts and crafts movement, and also then again with second wave Pre-Raphaelitism and other such similar movements, movements in the decorative arts. We have, at the same time as the Rider-Waite-Smith tarot deck came about, we have the art of the turn of the century Edwardian time period, which would be roughly contemporaneous with, for example, The Secret Garden, the movie, and the setting of the book. So these things, as you can see, start to link into each other in terms of what I get my ideas from, but then what ideas I like best. And then when I realize that they are in fact interconnected to some of these very early impressions. So I also really, really love very specific artists. I will mention 3 in this video, but with the understanding that it's really hard for me to only mention 3. And the whole reason I was struggling to make this video last week is because I spent literally, I think the video was something close to 50 minutes of me just waffling on about all my favorite things in a way that I'm absolutely positive would bore everyone to tears. So I will mention the art of James Christensen. I don't think it will be any surprise to literally anyone why I love his art as soon as I show it on screen. But very specifically, this is someone who has a very distinct vision for their imaginary, very fairy-informed, otherworldly realms. These fantastical landscapes and characters, a lot of nighttime settings. There's a recurring motif of flying fish, kind of indicating a sense of wonder and magic. And there's a very riddling sense as well, a lot of questions asked in the way in which these paintings and drawings are layered and overlapped on each other. And furthermore, James Christensen himself, although actually in reality was a Mormon and so on, and very, very Christian, which is, you know, neither here nor there, apparently crafted his house to reflect his imaginary realms so that you would actually have secret little rooms and compartments and turning corners to find sculptures and paintings on the walls and so on of the creatures that he imagined in his illustrations. So this is going to be a theme I'll come back to in a minute, but what you have is someone who imagines a world in a very otherworldly, airy-fairy kind of way, highly imaginative, but brings in art historical reference material, but also has clearly a very spatial and architectural understanding of that world. And in almost a very sort of Borgesian library fashion, creates a world in paintings that they are then able to replicate in their real life, at least in the area in which they have sovereign control, such as their house, and then can walk literally into the world of their imagination, and also make that practical. One's house still needs to serve its function. Another artist that I've been exposed to ever since I was quite young would be Kinuko Craft. I had a journal, I remember, when I was younger, with a particular image on the cover that, in addition to Kinuko Craft's art in general just being some of my favorite images I have ever seen, this one in particular, with its nighttime ambiance, time setting, the quality of light, the fact that it's a deep, deep wintry landscape outside, and that there is a kind of diffused glow about this character, about many of her characters, in a very quiet realm, about which you have no answers necessarily just looking at the image. You don't know what this realm is, what the rules of this realm are, why this person or this figure is there. And then we have the blossoming of little plants against a dark background, and she's playing the harp. So this scene, if you were to walk into it, would have sound. Was huge for me. And I was probably, I think when I was using that journal, I was maybe, I want to say I was about 9 years old. So I've been enamored of her art ever since. She does the covers for a lot of Patricia A. McKillop's novels. So for example, another amazing image is her piece for The Tower at Stonywood. But I'll have been putting loads of her images on screen, so you don't just have to stare at my face. You can look at what her art is and just ogle at it. So again, we have this sense of an architectural and very, very detail-oriented sensory experience of the imaginary realm manifesting in someone's art in very consistent and recognizable ways as well. And then the third artist I will mention is Sulamith Wulfing. Now, talk about the coolest name on the planet. Sulamith Wulfing's work, in a similar way to Kinuko Craft, has a very medieval-infused architectural, spatial, and internal glow kind of set of components to it. But I think in particular the art of Sulamith Wulfing is dusky, it is ephemeral, it is liminal. That sense of inner glow and the sheer truth in the face of these melancholic figures. Her landscapes and her way of expressing sensory experience is very sad. I see a lot of her paintings as feeling cold on the skin, cold and refreshing, but deeply, deeply quiet and sad. I would almost venture to say that her paintings are comparatively void of sound, unless it be the gentle flickering of candlelight or firelight, or perhaps a gentle sway of wind in the trees. That kind of thing. That's what that evokes for me. And I would have been exposed to her art less young, but the first time I ever saw it, I nearly lost my mind. Because, and this is part of what I'm getting to, is that as you are crafting your own personal preferences over time, not only are you going to be pursuing things that you like as a result of that, so coming across more inspirational material is increasingly plausible. Coming across that kind of material is increasingly plausible and likely. But then when you do, even if it's intentional, come across that material, it again has that reflexive nature of reinvigorating and further informing your own inner landscape. So I'm going to talk now, and hopefully not take too long, about a recent astral experience that I had that a little unusually for me was rather unexpected. And I actually just started to try and meditate. I'm working on regaining some of my patience with actually sitting in quiet. I don't like when I notice that I'm running from myself. So I was sitting there just trying, you know, to be present, and I ended up feeling quite meditative. And then in my imagination, I was suddenly walking down this long cloister-style, gallery-style hallway. On the one side, the side that would face in towards the convent structure, medieval convent structure. I did not actually have open archways. It was one long solid wall, but with carved moldings in the shape of archways. On my right side, the side that was facing, that would face the cloister garden, instead of open archways, they were leaded glass windows. Not stained glass, but leaded glass, segmented windows, so that a very diffused morning glow, the sunlight of morning, was coming in, and it was filling this hallway with just a very, very light and airy kind of color. Gentle color, not excessively bright. And I could just glimpse beyond the vaguely frosted style glass some of the weeds and sprigs of, say, early spring and that kind of thing. And I was walking down this hallway towards a pointed arch door with various carvings and things on it, very specific types of hinges. And I got to the door and slowly creaked it open. And I passed through this door into an almost utterly silent, wide, there was a sensation of very, very wide open space and almost entirely dark. The only sources of light were in these points of candlelight at regular intervals in the distance and in a circle. About, I would say, something like 8 of them in total, thereabouts. and each candle was it was set in a sconce in a circular wall around me. Above was an arched window, stained glass or, again, leaded glass. Below each one was a long, low wooden bench, very much like a church pew. I actually own a church pew. I've never shown it on this channel because it's actually downstairs. We don't have a space for it in our actual rooms because our rooms are too small at this time. So it kind of has our, like, where we plop our keys kind of stuff at the moment. But anyway, I was in this open space and I looked up, and again, this space was very much in the round. It was not beveled. I looked up and this space arched slowly into effectively a Gothic arch, but very much rounded at the top. And demarcating each segment, although not beveled, was a into the wall kind of limestone column. Not quite like flying buttress style, again, because those are external and this is internal. I can't remember the name of the thing I'm thinking of right now. But anyway, they matched up and unified into one point at the top. And in between each segment was painted or mosaic style, very, very dark folk blue medieval decor with golden stars, so that to look up you would see these compartments unifying at the top in a latticed kind of very medieval informed chapel-like structure with stars between against a blue background. And there were specific furnishings and things around me, and it was utterly cold and almost entirely silent, with only a very faint candle glow. And I myself was also glowing. It was not so much a visual glow, because the space was very dark. Moonlit, but otherwise very dark. But it was that kind of internal sacred feeling of calm and peace and privacy and quiet. And the structure that I was in turned out to be a large chapel-like limestone egg shape. I've done a sketch, which I will show on screen. But at a certain point, I walked into the space. I had passed through the door and closed the door behind me, and I walked straight across this space towards another door. And that door led to outside. Now, you may recall, I had walked down a hallway towards the initial door with morning light around me. And in this world into which I had passed, it was night. There was a sense of moon and starlight, but it was otherwise very dark and very, very cold. And I went to the other door that went out to the outside. And there were distant winter trees in a very Sulamith Wulfing style beyond. And there was the sound of wind in the trees, a gentle and there was nothing else, no other sound. And I leaned my face against the post of the door there, which actually was also arched, so it doesn't really have its own classic lintel. But it was so cold and soothing to the skin. And at a certain point, I took my face away from the limestone door and looked to my right to watch the curvature of the wall inward with the candles, small points of light along, and then I returned my face and leaned. And there was no one else. There was no one else in this world, as there often isn't in my imaginary realm. And I was just there. There was no sense even necessarily of the passage of time, in the sense that elements of plot were expected to happen. This was not a scenario where there'd be some wandering traveler who comes to see me or anything so narrative-based as that. Time existed in the sense that I was always there, and there may pass many, many years, and I could still be there. And I had this strange sensation that this was a deeply devotional space, and that I did serve a worshipful purpose, but not because I had been assigned by any kind of external entity to do so. And I had the sense that I was the lady of the chapel, the lady of the egg, the lady of the sacred egg, various iterations of that title. And that was it. That was the imagining. There were, in many ways, kind of distant hills, which often feature, again, it was nighttime, also a very frequent motif for me. Weeds by the bottom of the stone steps and things. Again, very secret garden, very Sulamith Wulfing, very, very intensely medieval. My clothing was medieval. I was robed in this very, very long, flowing, columnar, I suppose it was probably blue, but again, nighttime, a deep, rich wool. It was not anything like a fancy brocade or anything like that, but a very, very luscious, medieval wool. Perhaps something like a really, really flowing, draping twill or something like that. And I did have a small, not exactly crown, but something resembling a circlet on my head with a bit of a glistening quality to it, and underneath that, or as part of that, a long, almost translucent veil, either of the finest linen you could possibly imagine, or something like the finest silk you could possibly imagine, to the point where it was effectively almost invisible, very much as represented in certain art. And I have since returned to this space and walked around a bit outside and just sort of, you know, looked up into the night sky and just sort of contemplated and looked at details and so on, and looked at like trees and things, and it's hard to put into words, but effectively I also, in my waking life in consensus reality, spend a lot of time walking on my own, often at times of day where I'm at least a little less likely to encounter crowds. I think this will be evident in so, you know, for example, many of my Art Witch Chronicles videos. For, one that comes immediately to mind is the one I did for my winter astral realm for midwinter. Link in the description and so on and so forth. But what I have found out of that is that I was having a conversation recently actually with someone about the concept of clinging too hard to reference material and the standard that sometimes places on our ability to feel playful and experiment with our art, and just allow our art to exist for its own sake. And I think what's interesting is that one can get too intense about trying to represent something with accuracy. But what I find really interesting is the way in which reference material can function in the imaginary realm. You know, the more time I spend walking in morning twilight, especially in the winter, or in any kind of cold or misty or wet weather, which thankfully we get a lot of in this country, I end up crafting for myself this very strong lived experience of what that feels like, what the plants look like. I spend a lot of time, and occasionally when people do pass me, it's apparently stare-worthy, but I spend a lot of time taking very, very detailed photographs of these spaces, or filming branches blowing in the breeze. I often have either music playing, whether it's meditative or something like the songs of Hildegard von Bingen, or any form of medieval devotional music, or even modern metal. I like listening to a lot of All Them Witches and Color Haze while doing these walks. I'll tell you what, watching budding flowers to the House of Rushammon is a good combination. But the idea being that as I do this and experience, you know, I've been having certain encounters with hooded crows recently that I've been cultivating, and to be followed by hooded crows who are keeping just out of sight, so that you can only just barely see them as a gentle fluttering of dark, almost bluish gray, black and gray in the trees. For such a large bird, they're very, very subtle. You can carry that back home with you in your mind and worry less about needing to fill in the detail in your imagination, because you've lived it enough that it's like being able to imagine something that you see every day. And having that link in to the forms of inspiration that I've gathered since I was a child starts to feel very natural when it's practiced. And I've gone through phases of losing touch with that. And what I'm currently trying to do is rebuild that very, very intentionally. I've been going back and watching some of the sorts of films and looking into these various artists in a way that I hadn't quite in that way, I suppose, in a long time. So that's like a way of bringing reference material in to the imaginary realm. But then what I find really interesting, as I kind of indicated with James Christensen, is that one then can take that stuff from the imaginary realm and manifest, make it real. As I've kind of indicated with my own space around me, I really, really insist on having as much creative agency as I can legally procure. And when eventually I have my own house or anything that I own, you can absolutely bet that I will be going hog wild with ideas that I have been accumulating for my space. I think this is also why this ties into problematic tropes in current society around the sort of person who always has their head in the clouds. I think it is a desperate misrepresentation of what any of that is and what any of those words mean. I've certainly always been characterized as someone who's been very dreamy, very daydreamy, very airy-fairy, loosey-goosey, like all those sorts of terms, head in the clouds for sure. Ditzy even. I've been called that many a time in my life, and partly because I have an absolutely ridiculous manner of speech when I'm not trying to present to a camera, and hashtag actually autistic, but part of it's also that I am spending a lot of my time observing and imagining. It's not just daydreaming. You know, a person can say, and this has happened to me frequently, you know, people will say, you've got your head in the clouds and so on, and I will be walking along the street and someone will look at me real weird because I'm doing this. But what's so interesting to me is that they're looking at me, looking up. And where's the curiosity where they then go, what's she looking at? Let me look. Because I'm not just off in some world. I might be daydreaming, but I'm looking at something. There are a lot of sparrowhawks around here. Or I might be looking at a hooded crow. Or I might be looking up at a specific type of tree and noting that tree species. Or noting a very specific type of flower that grows only in the shade under certain conditions in this area. Often at the tops of walls. I have to look up to see that. If you look up, you will see snails along the tops of walls that are taller than me, and when I'm in certain types of shoes, I'm easily 6 foot tall. Again, Irish people in general are quite short, so maybe they just don't know what's up there. But the point is, sorry. But the point is that a lot of people will assume a person is airy-fairy and that serves no practical purpose. When really what they're not understanding is they fail to look where I look. They fail to see what I'm trying to learn to see. They fail to seek out what I'm trying to practice seeking out. And furthermore, to synthesize that in a very sensory experience of the world of the imagination, however one's brain does that, is part of how one develops vision for one's own life, to craft something that one could call a lifestyle. For example, in college, my friends at the time, every single year would go, oh, Sorsha, you always get the prettiest dorm rooms. Your dorm rooms are always so nice. I don't know why we always get the shit ones. And I would say, I have the same exact cinder block as the rest of you. It's an absolute prison cell. None of this stuff is particularly expensive, but I have zero chill and I need to decorate my space or else I will never be able to focus. I would just bring like sheets or colorful things, or I would make things to hang on the walls. Much of what's in this room would have been in my college dorm rooms, and I remember literally calculating the percentage of space we were allowed to cover on our walls before we risked violating fire safety codes. I knew that percentage, and I measured it on my walls because I didn't want to look at the horrible color that the walls were. So which one is more practical? Which one's more airy-fairy and dreamy? Which one's more logical? I don't see a separation between these things, and I think that the ways in which these things inform each other from young are very much important and very much part of how a personality manifests over time. And I think to discount that and to say that anything imaginary serves no practical purpose is really honestly quite binary thinking that to me makes no sense. I don't see those things as separate. Like, why would you? That seems to be some kind of highly arbitrary social arrangement of which I was not, in which I was not consulted. To put it, I suppose, in a very me-ish way. I hope that makes sense on a much more sort of broad level, that those of you watching can find applicable in your own way of doing things. I think this is part of why it is so crucial that we have the liberty to express ourselves visually however we want to, whether it's visuals or not, because that comes from a place that is internal and external at the same time. That comes from a lived experience. So the last point I'll just make is that every now and then this also allows me to very specifically develop a sense of priority that to someone else might look incredibly frivolous. I think this is why I don't take lightly the concept of aesthetics. So, for example, I'm currently wearing, I'll see if I can show, if not I'll show photographs. Ugh, shoes. I'm wearing shoes that I've had designed, and they're an absolute splurge on my part, and every now and then in life I manage to get around to a point where I can splurge on something big time, and usually that results in getting a either specifically commissioned or otherwise fairly one-of-a-kind piece, because I will have been thinking about it the whole time. So I had these designed. I picked out the fabric. I actually bought this fabric and sent it to the maker. I picked out the heel height. I liaised about the shape and size of the shoe and so on, measurements. I provided historical reference pieces and so on. And these shoes, the pattern on them is a William Morris print. So I had them commissioned, and I have been aware of the shop that I ended up going with for many years, and finally managed to get to a point where I was like, ah, now is the time, and then liaised, and then planned, and then paid for, and then, like, literally, like, the whole thing has been a long process. So even if we only consider the commissioning side of this, it's been many, many months in the making, and now they're on my feet, and I have secret garden feet. Which to someone else literally going like, oh my god, shoes seems really, really frivolous. And I'm like, not if you know what the references are, not if you understand literally anything about my personality, and not if you understand the ways in which I am very, very deliberate about what I do or don't place my focus on. You need to know why color theory matters to me. You need to know why I might look at a pair of shoes and hear music. And maybe it's also just that I get to respect myself enough to pour that kind of time and investment into just my feet. Like, why, to me, that's an incredibly sovereign thing to do. Now, there is absolutely an element of privilege in having gotten the opportunity to do this, in spite of the fact that it definitely involved crunching together, like, a few birthday presents and so on. But, you know, details aside, there's absolutely privilege in that, but it also does not have to be that it's that fancy. As I've indicated before, the furniture in this room, other than the IKEA crap and the stuff that unfortunately came with the apartment, is a lot of it trash picked or thrifted. I like to thrift things. I love old used things. I love that one can just dialogue with the past so readily and so cheaply, and make it anew, edit it, alter clothing. Like there's just a sense that one has an imaginary realm that one can make real and practical, that there are reasons that we prefer these things, and that consensus reality need not be so separated. There's a whole level of gray area between, a whole twilight realm, a whole liminal space from which those of us, I suppose, who identify as witches or who identify with this motif or this concept, we derive power from that. And that's how we manifest magic into the real world. And that's, at least from my perspective, partly what the imagination and the astral realm are for. So hopefully I've managed to convey what I've been trying to say in this video. But at any rate, I hope that at least there's something of value in it, even if it's just, you know, finding out about the art of Sulamith Wulfing or Kinuko I Craft or James Christensen and so on and so forth. So I hope everyone is doing well, taking care of themselves to the best of their ability, and being kind, and I'll see you all next time. Bye. Can we also just say for a moment that these earrings are just old vintage buttons and random bits of broken stuff that I had lying around, and color theory wise I match my shoes. So, hey, also egg symbolism. Bye.